The fluorescent lights in courtroom 14 hummed at a frequency that felt specifically designed to make already miserable people feel worse. Marisol Quinteros sat at the defendant's table with her hands folded in her lap, her posture the kind of rigid stillness that came not from fear, but from thousands of hours spent holding herself together while everything around her fell apart. She wore a dark blazer over a pale blue blouse. Someone had pressed it for her that morning. Someone who loved her, which made wearing it into this room feel like a kind of cruelty. The blazer smelled faintly of dry cleaning chemicals, not antiseptic, not kerosene, not the particular metallic bite of plasma burning against the edges of a chest wound at 6,000 feet above the Kunar Valley. She was 34 years old. She had been a nurse for 6 years. She had been a soldier for 7 before that. Between those two lives sat a distance that no resume adequately captured. There had been months in Kandahar province where the temperature reached 110 by 10 in the morning, and the dust found its way into everything. The seams of your uniform, the spaces between your molars, the back of your throat. There had been nights in Logar and Kunar where the sky was entirely dark, except for the green shimmer of night vision and the distant orange blossom of something going wrong somewhere on the ridgeline. She had done her work in the back of helicopters with her knees on a litter and her hands in a wound, and nothing but her training between a living person and whatever came next. None of the 7 showed up in the indictment. The charge was reckless endangerment of a patient. Unauthorized performance of a surgical procedure. The prosecutor, a man named Clifford Ashton, who wore his suits 3 sizes too tailored and smiled like a man who had never seen anything genuinely terrible happen to anyone he loved, was already arranging his notes on the lectern with the careful precision of someone planning a performance. He was good at this. He had a record of 42 convictions in cases involving medical professionals. He wrote about the cases in a legal blog he updated twice a week. He considered himself a guardian of professional standards. What he had not done in the preparation of this case was ask the obvious question that any investigator worth the title would have asked the moment they encountered a nursing candidate with a 7-year gap filled by military service. He had not pulled her DD 214. He had not called the Army's Human Resources Command to ask what a 68 WF specialty code meant, or what it took to earn one, or what the operational tempo of a DUSTOFF medevac unit during a 2-front war. He had the arrest report, the hospital records, the licensing board's referral, and the testimony of a physician who had been embarrassed in his own emergency bay. He had built his architecture outward from those materials and had done it well. He had simply neglected to check whether the foundation had a flaw beneath it. Marisol watched him arrange those papers and thought about her Ridgeline she had watched from the door of a Black Hawk helicopter at 2 in the morning, about the way the mountains looked in the thermal scope when they were still and waiting, about what it felt like to know the still wouldn't last. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Morrow, settled into her chair with the measured weight of someone who had stopped being impressed by courtrooms somewhere around her 3rd decade on the bench. She had silver hair and reading glasses she pushed up into it when she wasn't using them, and she looked at the room with the particular exhaustion of someone who understood that most of what happened in it was theater. Marisol understood theater. She had sat in 2 Army courts of inquiry and 1 congressional briefing. She knew the difference between a proceeding designed to find the truth and one designed to produce a predetermined result. She had known the difference before she was 25 years old. She also understood that it didn't matter, at least not for her survival. You held your position. You maintained the airway. You kept the blood inside the body. The theater could run as long as it needed to. The jury filed in 12 people who had agreed, under questioning, that they could evaluate the facts objectively. 8 of them had family members who worked in health care. One of them was a retired paramedic. None of them knew that the woman they were about to judge had once kept 3 men alive through a 27-minute medevac flight, during which 2 of them shouldn't have survived the first 8 minutes, based on the nature and severity of their wounds. The sealed records in the military archive in Falls Church, Virginia, knew. The envelope on the defense table knew. The woman who had signed it, a retired Army colonel named Deborah Haynes, who was sitting in the gallery wearing civilian clothes and watching Clifford Ashton the way a hawk watches a mouse moving through grass, knew. But first, Clifford Ashton was going to tell the jury that Marisol Quinteros was reckless, that she had endangered a life, that she had exceeded the bounds of her license and her role and her rightful place in the hierarchy of a functioning medical system. He was going to do it very well. And then the room was going to learn something about the defendant that Clifford Ashton had specifically and deliberately failed to include in his case file. 17 days before the trial opened, at 11:43 on a Wednesday night, a man named Dennis Ferraro was brought into the emergency bay of Mercy General Hospital on a gurney that had blood on the wheel struts before the paramedics even got him through the doors. Marisol had been 3 hours into a double shift. She had eaten half a granola bar at 6 p.m. and forgotten about the other half. Her feet knew the particular ache of 12-hour tile. Standing, that deep bruising throb that starts in the arches and works up toward the small of the back, and she had been managing it the way she managed everything. She couldn't fix, she had stopped noticing it. The triage call had come through on the intercom in a flat, procedural voice. Blunt force, abdominal trauma, possible internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping, pulse thready and irregular. Raymond Becker, a 49-year-old internist with 3 decades of general medicine and a reputation for careful, methodical decision-making. He was not a trauma surgeon. Mercy General's trauma surgeon, Dr. Linvo, had been called in from home and was in transit. Estimated arrival, 9 minutes. 9 minutes is a long time. Marisol had worked with people who could tell you exactly how long 9 minutes was. She was one of them. In her second deployment, she had watched a Special Forces sergeant's blood pressure drop from 92 systolic to 61 in 4 minutes and 20 seconds following a penetrating abdominal wound from a 7.62 millimeter rifle round. They had been 17 minutes. From the surgical facility at that moment, she had kept him alive. He had walked out of the Roll 3 hospital in Bagram 6 weeks later and had sent her a photograph of himself at a cookout back in Fayetteville the following summer, standing in a t-shirt with a beer in one hand. The kind of photograph that ordinary people take at ordinary moments without fully appreciating what it cost someone else to make that moment possible. She had that photograph in a shoebox in her apartment. She had a shoebox full of things like it. Dennis Ferraro was 41 years old, a contractor who had fallen from a scaffold at a job site in the rain. The fall had been 12 feet. The impact had been concrete. The internal damage was consistent with what 12 feet onto concrete at 4 in the morning does to a human torso: ruptured spleen, bleeding into the abdominal cavity, and early signs of what Marisol recognized within the first 45 seconds of looking at him, as hemorrhagic shock progression that was moving faster than the timeline they were operating on. She told Dr. Becker what she was seeing. She told him clearly and specifically using the terminology she had used in 7 years of Army medicine: systolic pressure 78 and falling, respiratory rate 24, and climbing, pale and clammy, altered mentation. She told him that she thought the window for stabilization with fluids alone was already narrow and closing. Dr. Becker heard her. He disagreed with her assessment of the urgency. He ordered 2 large-bore IVs, a fluid bolus, and instructed her to prepare the patient for imaging. Marisol ran the IVs. She started the bolus. She watched the numbers on the monitor, and she counted seconds in the back of her mind, the way she had learned to count them in a different context, in the back of a Sikorsky U-860 at altitude, where the wind came through every gap in the airframe. Call, or the patient died. The emergency bay at Mercy General was warmer than a helicopter, and quieter, and smelled of alcohol solution rather than adjugus and burned propellant. There were no mountains outside. There was a ceiling and walls, and a crash cart within arm's reach, and another practitioner in the building if she needed one. And still the numbers said what they said. Blood pressure falling, heart rate compensating, trying to keep up with a volume deficit that the bolus was not going to correct. The abdomen rigid, the way an abdomen gets when there is blood pooling in free space. The clock on the wall, showing that the window they were operating in was not 9 minutes wide, had never been 9 minutes wide, and was getting narrower by the moment. Vo was in a car moving through city streets at whatever speed the traffic allowed, and Marisol Quinteros was standing at a hospital gurney with her hands available and her training intact and a decision forming in front of her with the particular clarity of a decision that has already been made at some cellular level. At minute 4, Dennis Ferraro's blood pressure dropped to 61/40. Dr. Becker was on the phone with the radiologist. Marisol picked up the phone at the nurse's station and called trauma surgery directly. Wo answered on the 3rd ring. Marisol told her what she had: pressure, rate, clinical picture, her assessment of the abdominal bleed and the rate of progression. Dr. Vo asked 2 questions. Both were answered correctly. Wo said, "Do you have a resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion catheter available?" The ARI-BOA, a device that in the right hands can slow catastrophic internal bleeding by temporarily occluding the aorta, buying time until surgical intervention is possible. Mercy General had 2. They were on the crash cart in Bay 3. Dr. Vo said, "I'll be there in 4 minutes, prep for placement." Marisol said, "I don't think we have 4 minutes, Doctor." Dr. Vo said, "Can you place it?" 1 beat of silence. The kind of silence that in 7 years of Army medicine had preceded some of the most consequential moments of her life. Marisol said, "Yes." Dr. Vo gave verbal authorization. She documented it on the call from her vehicle. She arrived at the hospital at 11:59 and completed the surgical stabilization. Dennis Ferraro went to the OR at 12:14, underwent emergency splenectomy and hemorrhage control, and was in the ICU by 3:15 the following morning with vital signs that the surgical resident described as, quote, "much better than he had any right to expect given the timeline." Marisol went home at 7 a.m. She slept until noon, she ate toast and thought about nothing in particular, and went back in for her next shift at 3. 2 weeks later, the hospital's risk management team referred the case to the county medical board. The board referred it to the district attorney's office. The district attorney's office assigned it to Clifford Ashton, who saw in it the kind of clean narrative he was very good at constructing. A nurse, out of her lane, performing a procedure she was not licensed to perform, endangering a patient. He did not request the military records of the defendant. He had been told they were sealed. He had not been told why. Sealed military records are not uncommon. They can be sealed for reasons ranging from the administrative to the sensitive, and a prosecutor without military experience and without an investigative instinct tuned toward that particular frequency would not necessarily know what questions to ask. What they might contain. What a flight medic's record from 3 combat tours actually looked like when you laid it out on a table. What the Army's system of performance review and promotion produced in 7 years in the case of someone who was genuinely exceptional and knew it and had the missions to prove it. He had seen the discharge as honorable and the credentials as current and the background check as clean, and he had moved on. It was an understandable error. It was about to stop being his alone to bear. Clifford Ashton was the kind of speaker who understood rhythm. He had learned early in his career that juries respond to cadence more than content, that the feeling of an argument settling into place is almost physical, and that if you could make 12 people feel certain before they had heard any evidence, you had already won half the case. He stepped to the lectern and looked at the jury for exactly 4 seconds before he began. It was a technique. 4 seconds. Long enough to establish connection. Short enough not to seem calculating. On the night of November 14th, he said, Dennis Farrow was brought into the emergency bay of Mercy General Hospital in critical condition. He was afraid. He was in pain. And he was entirely dependent on the medical professionals around him to operate within the boundaries of their training, their licensure, and the law. He let that settle. Marisol Quinteros is a registered nurse. She is not a physician. She is not a surgeon. She is not a board-certified practitioner authorized to perform endovascular procedures. Those distinctions exist for a reason. They are not bureaucratic inconveniences. They are the architecture of a medical system that keeps patients safe. He walked 3 steps to the left, turned back. On that night, Miss Quinteros made a unilateral decision. She decided that her own judgment superseded the judgment of the physician in that bay, that she alone knew what that patient needed, and that she alone had the right to act on that belief. It was a clinical image, the kind that looked like nothing to a layperson and like everything to someone who understood what they were looking at. The procedure she performed, the placement of a Reboa catheter, is a procedure that requires specific training, specific certification, and specific authorization. The authorization she claimed she received was a verbal authorization from a physician who was not physically present, given over a phone call while driving, based solely on the assessment of a nurse who had decided the situation was beyond her own scope. He set the photograph down. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about outcomes. Mr. Ferraro survived. We are grateful for that. This case is about whether one person's unchecked confidence, their willingness to substitute their own judgment for the systems we have built to protect the most vulnerable among us, constitutes a danger to every patient who walks through those doors. He looked at Marisol. She met his eyes without any expression at all. Mrs. Quinteros is not a hero. She is a defendant, and the evidence will show you why. He walked back to his table and sat down with the precise satisfaction of a man who believed he had just told the truth. In the gallery, Colonel Deborah Haynes, retired, 31 years of service, former commander of the 82nd Medical Brigade, wrote one word in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She had been taking notes in small notebooks for 3 decades. The word she wrote was, "Wait." The prosecution spent 2 days building its case. Ashton was methodical and precise. Becker, who testified in the careful, measured tone of a man who understood that he was both a witness and, on some level, a subject, that he had assessed the patient, made his clinical decisions, and that in his judgment the situation had not yet reached the threshold. He was asked directly, was the patient in imminent danger of death in the moments before the nurse's intervention? Dr. Becker paused. He said, the patient was critically ill, but there were steps remaining in the standard protocol that had not yet been exhausted. Ashton nodded with the satisfied deliberateness of a man hearing exactly what he expected. He called the hospital's risk management director, who testified about licensure boundaries and institutional protocol. He called a medical expert, a vascular surgeon from a teaching hospital in Boston named Dr. Pierce Whitmore, who testified that the Ariboe placement procedure, while within the technical capability of some advanced practice nurses in specific credentialed programs, was not within the scope of practice of a registered nurse. Ashton introduced the records, the call log, the timestamps, the nursing credentials, which were impeccable, every continuing education credit completed, every certification current, no prior disciplinary history. He used the clean record as a point of misdirection, as a way of saying, she is not incompetent, she is overconfident. She is the kind of person who has been very, very good for a long time and has therefore concluded that the rules are for other people. He introduced a section of testimony from a senior charge nurse at Mercy General who had been on the floor that night and who said very carefully that she had been uncertain, watching the situation unfold, about whether the protocol was being followed appropriately. He asked the charge nurse, "Did you believe the patient would have died without the intervention?" The charge nurse was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't know. I'm not qualified to say that." Ashton nodded. "None of us are. That's the point." Marisol sat through all of it with the same quality of stillness she had maintained since the moment she walked through the courtroom door. Her attorney, a compact woman named Verena O'Shea, who had spent 15 years handling complex medical liability cases and who had made a point of reviewing Marisol's full background before agreeing to take the case, had told her during their preparation sessions, "Don't. The jury will watch your face during every word of testimony. Your job is to look like someone who has nothing to be ashamed of because you don't." Marisol had said, "I know how to be still." Verena had looked at her carefully. She had asked, "You've testified before." Marisol had said twice. Under different circumstances, Verena had not asked more. She had made a note. She had made a phone call. On the morning of the third day, she was a small woman. 5'2", maybe 5'3", in the low heels she wore to court. She had the kind of presence that had nothing to do with size, the kind that comes from understanding. Completely and without performance, exactly what she was doing and why. She stepped to the lectern and looked at the jury. She did not begin with the night of November 14th. She said, "Before we talk about what happened in that emergency bay, I want to tell you who Marisol Quinteros is, because Mr. Ashton told you she was a defendant. I'm going to tell you she's something else." She put a single photograph on the projector. It was a group photograph, the kind taken before deployment soldiers in Army combat uniform, with the particular squinted, slightly too bright look that comes from standing in direct sun in a place that gets a lot of it. Marisol was in the middle row, second from the left. She looked younger. She looked the same. This photograph was taken in 2015 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, before the deployment of the 45th Medical Company to Afghanistan. Marisol Quinteros enlisted in the United States Army at the age of 19. She went to combat medic school at Fort Sam Houston. She was subsequently selected for and completed the Army's DUSTOFF flight medic training program. She let that sit for a moment. DUSTOFF, dedicated unhesitating service, to our fighting forces, the Army's medevac program. Specifically, the program that sends helicopter crews into active combat zones to retrieve wounded personnel under fire to bring them back alive. She advanced to the next slide. It was a table with numbers. Over the course of 3 combat deployments, Afghanistan twice, Iraq once, Marisol Quinteros served as a flight medic on a UH-60 Black Hawk medevac aircraft. He flew 217 confirmed medevac missions. She was directly responsible for the primary care of 304 wounded personnel during those missions. Of those 304 patients, 291 survived to reach a surgical facility. A juror in the second row, a woman in her 50s who had said, during voir dire, that she had a son who had served in the Army, looked up. The Army keeps detailed records, Verena said. I'm going to introduce those records into evidence this morning. I'm also going to introduce a document that has been under military seal, not classified, but sealed at the administrative level. Quinteros separated from the Army and entered the civilian workforce. Ashton was on his feet before Verena finished the sentence. The argument about the sealed records had been made in pre-trial motions, and again in a conference in chambers the previous afternoon, Ashton had argued that the records were irrelevant to the charges and potentially prejudicial. Verena had argued that the records were directly relevant to the defendant's training, her demonstrated competence in performing emergency medical procedures under pressure, and the assessment she made on the night in question. Judge Morrow had reserved ruling until trial. She ruled now. The records may be introduced. Judge Morrow said, "Counsel, proceed." The envelope was standard military issue, heavy buff paper, sealed with red wax that had been applied with the stamp of the Department of the Army. Verena broke the seal at the defense table with no particular ceremony, the way you open something that has been waiting a long time for this specific moment. She handed the document to the court clerk. The clerk read the caption into the record. Service record, summary and commendation file. Quinteros, Marisol Elena, Sergeant First Class, United States Army Medical Corps, Branch 68W/68WF, Flight Medic. The clerk's voice was professionally neutral, but she paused very briefly. On the rank Sergeant First Class. In the Army, you don't reach Sergeant First Class in 7 years without a very particular kind of record. It is an E7, a senior, non-commissioned officer grade, that most soldiers don't achieve until well into their 2nd decade of service, if they achieve it at all. To reach it in 7 years requires a combination of demonstrated performance, peer evaluations, and selection board decisions that are, in their own quiet way, as competitive as anything else the institution produces. Marisol had not mentioned her rank when she applied for her nursing license. It was not required. She had mentioned her honorable discharge, her DD 214, her training certifications. Ashton was very still at his table. Verena said, "I'd like to introduce the following items from this file as defense exhibits." She went through them methodically. The Army Combat Medic School Completion Certificate, the Flight Medic Qualification Certification, the Combat Deployment Records, 3 tours, dates, and locations listed with a procedural flatness that doesn't quite convey what the locations felt like at ground level. The mission logs, 147 total pages of flight records, patient assessments, interventions performed. She paused at one page. She asked the clerk to read the heading. The clerk said, "Award Citation, Soldier's Medal, 2017. She read the text. It was a paragraph. dense with the specific vocabulary of Army commendations, but the plain meaning came through. During a mission in Logar Province on the 14th of March 2017, Sergeant Quinteros had kept a patient with a penetrating abdominal wound and developing hemorrhagic shock alive for 31 minutes in the back of an aircraft, using improvised pressure dressings, 2 IV lines placed under turbulence, and a manually assisted airway without a physician, without anything except training and judgment, until they reached the Roll 2 facility at Bagram. The patient was a 19-year-old from Macon, Georgia. His name was in the record. He had gone home to Macon 2 months later. The next citation was the Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device, then the Air Medal awarded for the 200th medevac mission. Then a letter signed by the Commanding General of the 101st Airborne, addressed to Sergeant Quinteros, dated 3 months before her separation date, recommending her for a competitive grant to pursue a nursing degree and expressing the institutional view, of the kind rarely seen even among career military medical personnel. The room was very quiet. Ashton picked up a pen, put it down, picked it up again. She looked at the table in front of her, not at the jury, not at Ashton, not at the document her records made of her life. She looked at the table the way you look at a fixed point when you are maintaining orientation in difficult conditions. When the horizon is unreliable, you pick something close and you hold it. Judge Morrow looked at Ashton over her reading glasses. He had a choice to make. He could object. He could argue about relevance. He could try to limit the damage. But he understood, in the way a good lawyer understands things that are happening to him in real time in a courtroom, that the room had already shifted. That whatever architecture he had spent 2 days constructing had just had a foundational element removed. He did not object. Verena said, "Your Honor, I have one witness to call in conjunction with these records." She said, "The defense calls Deborah Haynes." Colonel Deborah Haynes walked to the witness stand without hurrying, which was the first thing the jury noticed about her. She wore a plain gray blazer and slacks. She had short, silver hair and the particular carriage of someone who had spent decades moving through spaces where how you moved communicated information about who you were. She sat down, arranged herself, and looked at Verena Osei with the calm, assessing attention of someone who had been briefed and was ready. Verena established her credentials, which took several minutes, and which the jury followed with the absorbed focus of people learning that they had misunderstood what they were looking at. 31 years of active duty Army service. Commander of the 82nd Medical Brigade. 4 combat deployments across 3 theaters. The last 3 years of her service as the Chief Medical Officer of the XP Airborne Corps, overseeing medical care for 60,000 soldiers in a combat support configuration. Retired at 07, Brigadier General, she had been promoted in the final year before her retirement, which Verena noted matter-of-factly and which produced a brief rustling adjustment in the jury box. Verena asked, "In your expert opinion, what does the DUSTOFF flight medic training and operational experience qualify a practitioner to do?" Haynes said in a precise and unhurried voice, "A qualified DUSTOFF flight medic, particularly one with Sergeant Quinteros' operational record, is trained and has demonstrated the ability to perform emergency medical interventions up to and including hemorrhage control, tourniquet application and monitoring, and, yes, resuscitative endovascular procedures in austere environments without direct physician oversight." She said that last point is important because in a combat medevac situation, there is no physician on the aircraft. There is a medic, a crew, and a patient. The medic makes the calls. Verena said, and in your assessment, the patient on the night of November 14th, based on the clinical data recorded in the nursing notes, what was the trajectory of that patient's condition? Haynes said, based on the documented vital signs, systolic pressure, 78, and declining, tachycardia, altered mental status, rigid and tender abdomen with percussion consistent with significant hemoperitoneum. Minutes without aggressive intervention? She said, in a medevac context, we call that a Category A urgent surgical. You don't wait for more data, you treat, Verena said. And the intervention Ms. Quinteros performed? Haynes said the RE-BAW-A placement she performed, with verbal authorization from the incoming trauma surgeon, is consistent with what I would expect of a practitioner of her training and experience. It is also consistent with what she would have been authorized to do in a combat zone, without any physician communication at all. The difference between what she did and what she did every week for 7 years is that she was standing on linoleum instead of in a helicopter. Ashton got to cross-examine. He asked, Colonel Haynes, would you agree that there is a difference between military medical standards and civilian hospital standards? Haynes said, yes. He asked, and the defendant was operating in a civilian hospital under civilian licensing standards, correct? Haynes said she was. He said, and those standards exist to protect patients. Haynes said, they do. He said, so your position is that Miss Quinteros should be held to military standards in a civilian context. Haynes was quiet for a moment. She said, my position, Mr. Ashton, is that the standards exist to ensure that practitioners have the competence to perform the procedures they perform. I am here to testify about whether Marisol Quinteros had that competence. She had more of it than most of the surgeons who will enter this hospital today. The licensing framework is about demonstrating competence through an institutional pathway. It is not the only pathway through which competence can be demonstrated and verified. Her record verifies it beyond any threshold I am aware of. She said, the patient is alive. He is alive because she correctly identified the trajectory of his condition before anyone else in that bay had reached the same conclusion, made a call under pressure that she has made under significantly worse pressure 217 times. Whether the paperwork was filed in the right sequence afterward is a question for risk management, not for a criminal court. She said one more thing. She said it slowly, with the precision of someone who had chosen each word with the specific intention that it would not be misunderstood. She said, I have commanded military medical units in 4 combat theaters. I have reviewed the records and assessed the performance of thousands of practitioners across 3 decades. I have seen people who had every credential in the building and no instinct, and I have seen people who had been trained in conditions that no certification program can replicate and whose judgment I trusted with my life and the lives of everyone under my command. Marisol Quinteros is the second kind of person. This prosecution has treated her as the first kind of problem. I believe that is a mistake the record does not support. The jury box was very quiet. Ashton said nothing further. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a room when the story it believed itself to be watching changes. It is not the silence of shock, exactly, or the silence of boredom. It is the silence of recalibration, of 12 people and a judge and a bailiff and a prosecutor and a gallery full of observers, all simultaneously revising the framework through which they have been interpreting the preceding hours. It lasted for approximately 4 seconds after Ashton sat down. Then it broke into a low, fractured murmur that Judge Morrow silenced with her gavel in a single, clean motion. The redirect examination of Colonel Haynes lasted 9 minutes and covered 3 additional points: the REBO, a procedure itself, and what it required. Technically, a review of the specific interventions in Marisol's Army mission logs that were comparable to what she had performed at Mercy General, and one final exchange that Verena had designed deliberately as the last thing the jury would hear before the afternoon recess. She asked, "Colonel Haynes, in your 31 years of service, including 4 combat deployments, how many medevac flight medics reached Sergeant First Class in 7 years?" Haynes said, "In my career, I worked with or reviewed the records of approximately 4,000 flight medics. 4 of them made Sergeant First Class in 7 years. 3 of them were decorated multiple times. One of them is sitting at that table. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. The architecture of a courtroom is designed to absorb exactly this kind of information, to hold it still, to let it sit in the record, to allow the weight of it to be felt without performance." The jury held that weight. Ashton requested a brief recess. Judge Morrow granted 15 minutes. Ashton spent 9 of those minutes in a conference call with his supervisor at the DA's office. He came back to the courtroom and sat down. He did not write anything on it for several minutes. The closing arguments were not the climax. The climax had already happened. What remained was the language in which the resolution would be stated. Ashton went first by right of procedure, and he did something that surprised several observers in the gallery. He modified his argument, not entirely. He did not concede the case, but the absolute certainty of his opening, "She had no right. She exceeded her bounds. She must answer for this," had been replaced by something more cautious. He talked about precedent. He talked about the importance of systems. He talked about the danger of allowing individual judgment to override institutional frameworks. Even when the individual's judgment happened to be correct, he was careful. He was thoughtful. He acknowledged, in the particular language of a man who is rebuilding a position under fire, that the defendant's background was exceptional and that her intentions were clearly not malicious. But, he said, that was precisely the point. The road to the erosion of patient safety protections was not paved with bad intentions. It was paved with good ones, with people who were confident, people who had been right before. People who had been right before in settings that were different from the setting they were currently operating in, and who had not fully appreciated that difference. He looked at the jury, he looked at Marisol, he looked at his notes. It was, observers noted, a very different argument from the one he had planned to give. It was also, and he would recognize this in the weeks that followed, a better argument. It was just too late to matter. Verena's closing was 22 minutes. She walked through the record systematically, item by item, the same way she would have walked through a medical chart, mission by mission, commendation by commendation. The trajectory of a patient's vital signs, and the decision made at the exact right moment by the exact right person to be standing in that bay on that night. She said Marisol Quinteros has spent her entire adult life in service to people in the worst moments of their lives. She learned how to do that in a helicopter flying into active fire. She learned it with her hands and her training and the particular kind of nerve that doesn't come from a classroom. It comes from doing the thing in the worst possible conditions and discovering that you can. She brought that knowledge here. She brought it into a bay where a man was dying, and she used it. She said, "The question before you is not whether Marisol Quinteros. The question is, whether what she did constituted criminal recklessness, and I am asking you to look at the record of the woman who did it and tell me, honestly, whether recklessness is a word that belongs in the same sentence. She went back to her table. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 17 minutes. The courtroom had a particular smell in the late afternoon, the recycled air from the HVAC system, the accumulated paper of the exhibits, the faint residue of coffee from the bailiff's thermos. The light through the high windows had gone orange and horizontal by the time the jury filed back in. Marisol sat straight. The foreperson was a woman named Margaret who had described herself during voir dire as a retired high school principal. She stood with the practiced composure of someone who had delivered important information to people who were waiting for it many times. She said, "On the charge of reckless endangerment of a patient, not guilty." She said, "On the charge of unauthorized performance of a surgical procedure, not guilty." The sound in the room was the sound of people breathing out. Not loud, not a cheer. Just the collective exhalation of a crowd that has been holding tension and has now been given permission to release it. A woman in the gallery, Dennis Ferraro's sister, who had attended every day of the trial, and who had given a statement to the press the previous morning saying that her brother was alive, and that the nurse had saved his life, and that she didn't understand what anyone thought they were doing in that courtroom, pressed both hands flat against her mouth. Ashton sat still. He nodded once, in the specific way of someone who understood that the outcome was correct, and who would need some time before he could say so out loud. Judge Morrow looked at Marisol. She said, "Quinteros, you are acquitted on all charges. You are free to go." Verena Osei put a hand on Marisol's arm. Marisol looked at the room, at the jury, some of whom were looking at her with expressions she recognized. Not pity, something warmer and more complicated. At the gallery where Colonel Haynes had closed her notebook and was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady at the windows and the orange light coming through them. She thought about a helicopter coming in low over a valley, the rotor wash bending the grass flat, the crew chief pulling back the door, the particular weight of a litter coming in through the opening. She thought about the way the mountains looked from altitude, about what it meant to be called to a position and to hold it. She said to no one in particular, "Thank you." It wasn't directed at the jury exactly, or at Verena, or at the room. It was said in the way you say something when the accounting has finally been done, and the balance came out right, and you didn't know, going in. Outside the courthouse, in the low, late afternoon light, reporters waited. Verena walked beside her. Colonel Haynes fell in on Marisol's other side without being asked, a flanking maneuver that Marisol recognized, and that made something ease slightly in her chest. A reporter asked Miss Quinteros, "How do you feel?" Marisol looked at the camera for a moment. She had dark eyes and the particular economy of expression of someone who had spent years reading a room and deciding what to show and when. She said, "I feel like I should get back to work." She said it simply, not as a performance, not as a line, as a fact, the same way you state a patient's blood pressure, or a flight altitude, or a grid coordinate. She had places to be. There were people waiting. Dennis Ferraro had sent a card to the hospital while she was on administrative leave. It had arrived 3 days after the charges were filed. It was a regular card, the kind from a grocery store display rack, with a generic design of a flower on the front. Inside he had written in the slightly shaky handwriting of someone who had recently been hospitalized, "I heard what happened. I don't know if this helps. I'm still here because of you. Thank you." She had folded it into fourths and put it in her scrub pocket. She had carried it every day since. She was going to carry it back in tomorrow. She had thought in the weeks between the arrest and the acquittal about what she would do if the verdict went the other way. She had thought about it the way you think about the bad outcome during a mission, not obsessively, but specifically, so that, if it happens, you are not improvising. She had run through the scenarios with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything. She had concluded that she would appeal. She had concluded that she would fight. She had also concluded in a quieter moment, sitting in her apartment at 2 in the morning, with the city sounds coming in through the window, that she was not afraid of it. She had been in worse positions than a court of law. She had been in positions where the outcome was not determined by evidence and argument, but by physics and blood volume and the particular fortitude of a stranger's cardiovascular system. She had learned in those positions that you did not get to know the outcome in advance. You did the work. You maintained the airway. You kept the blood inside the body. You waited for the numbers to tell you what they told you. The work was the work. The floors needed walking. The monitors needed reading. The vein needed to be found on the first try, even in the bad light, at 2 in the morning. The call needed to be made when the numbers said what they said, and the window was closing, and there was nobody else in the room who had seen what she had seen or done what she had done. The hospital would keep her. She walked down the courthouse steps with Colonel Haynes on one side and Verena O'Shea on the other, and the reporter's questions blurred into the background, the way a lot of sounds blur when you've spent enough time learning to distinguish the critical signal from the noise. The only sound she was really listening to was the click of her own heels on the concrete and the city moving around her, ordinary and alive. In the weeks that followed, several things happened. The hospital's legal team reviewed the case and issued a statement that it supported Mrs. Quinteros and affirmed her reinstatement to full clinical duties. The risk management director sent a memo, internal, not for public release, recommending that the hospital's credentialing committee review the process for assessing military medical experience in the context of scope of practice determinations. B. A subcommittee was formed. It met twice. It produced a revised intake document for candidates with military medical training backgrounds that asked, specifically, about DUSTOFF certification, flight medic qualification, combat tour count. The document was 4 pages. It was the first time in the hospital's history that such a document existed. Dr. Lin Vo, the trauma surgeon, gave a brief statement to the hospital board in which she said that her verbal authorization had been clear, documented, and appropriate, and that in her professional opinion the intervention had been correctly timed and correctly performed. She said, "I've seen a lot of rebore placements. That one was textbook. I don't know where she learned it, but she learned it right." Clifford Ashton did not update his legal blog for 6 weeks. When he did, he wrote a piece about the challenges of prosecuting cases involving practitioners with non-traditional training backgrounds. It was careful and measured. It did not mention Marisol by name. Several people who had followed the trial read it and left comments. He approved the comments and did not respond to them. Dennis Ferraro was discharged from the follow-up care program 6 weeks after his surgery. He had regained full function. His sister, who had taken 2 weeks off from her job as a school administrator to attend the trial, went home and wrote a letter to the county hospital board. She didn't know if it would do anything. She sent it anyway. Colonel Haynes went back to Virginia. She added a notation to the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. The notation said, "SFC Quinteros, verdict correct," and Marisol Quinteros. She worked a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule for the first 2 weeks, per the hospital's standard reinstatement protocol. Some of the staff had been following the trial Most of them had known nothing about her army service before it began. There was a particular quality to how they looked at her in those first days back. Not quite awe, not quite discomfort. Something in between. The way you look at someone when you realize you have been standing next to a depth you hadn't detected. She did not make a speech about it. She did not explain herself. She put on her scrubs, and she found the charge nurse, and she asked where she was needed. Then she went back to her regular rotation. She covered 2 overnight shifts the following week and a day shift on Saturday that ran 45 minutes over because there was a pediatric patient in Bay 4 with a presentation that needed watching. She watched it. She was standing at the nurse's station at 7:12 on a Wednesday morning, halfway through a cup of coffee that had been hot 40 minutes ago, when the intercom called a trauma alert for Bay 1. She set the cup down. She pulled her hair tighter. She walked toward the sound. The floors were still hard. The lights were still too bright. The monitors beeped in their flat, informational way, carrying data about whether people were inside the correct margins of being alive. Someone had left a supply cart in the corridor again. The coffee in the break room was the same brand it had always been. Slightly bitter, slightly too hot. Good enough. Marisol had been in worse places. She had been in the back of an aircraft above mountains in the dark, with people bleeding, with the rotor noise so loud you felt it in your sternum, and she had done what needed doing, and she had gotten them home. She could do the same here. She had always been able to do the same here. That was the thing. Nobody in that courtroom had fully understood, until Deborah Haynes put it into words, that the woman standing in that emergency bay on the night of November 14th, looking at a man's declining vital signs, had already done this harder. Already been here, or somewhere, so much worse that this, on her absolute worst day, was familiar ground. The doors to Bay 1 opened ahead of her. She could hear voices, the clipped functional shorthand of a trauma response getting organized. Assessment and counter-assessment. Someone calling for an IV line. She pushed through. The next hour existed entirely in the present tense, which is the only place any of it was ever happening anyway. That is where Marisol Quinteros had always lived. Not in a courtroom. Not in a record file. Not in an envelope sealed with military wax in the bay, at altitude, in the exactly right moment, doing the exactly right thing. If this story left you with something, a recognition of what we ask people to carry when they come home, a sense of what it costs to be both citizen and soldier, and then to have your own judgment. Stories like Marisol's deserve to be heard, and your share puts it in front of someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the people who run toward what the rest of us run from.